They say Christmas reveals the best in people. But sometimes, it exposes the worst. At the Whitmore estate, holiday lights shimmered and laughter filled the halls. Claire Whitmore smiled, served dinner, and watched as her husband laughed with an old college friend no one expected to see, Vanessa. There was something in the way they touched, the way they looked at each other when they thought no one noticed. But Claire noticed everything. And what she discovered behind locked phone screens and midnight whispers was a betrayal deeper than snowdrifts outside. This Christmas, the truth wouldn't come wrapped in ribbons. It would spill out in front of everyone, bloody, brutal, and unforgettable. Before we continue, friends, I kindly ask you to subscribe to my channel. It only takes a second for you, but for me, it's an extra motivation to keep creating videos. I'd also really appreciate a comment. Thank you for your support. And now, let's continue with the story. Claire didn't touch her wine. She held the glass delicately, her fingers trailing up and down the stem like she was tracing the shape of a memory. Her eyes fixed on the pair seated across the room. The living room flickered with firelight, casting warm hues on the polished hardwood and softening the edges of furniture she had chosen herself. But even the warmth felt distant now, as if the house was leaning away from her, slightly off balance. Vanessa had made herself comfortable, not in the casual way of a new guest trying to blend in, but in the manner of someone returning to a place they used to know. Easing into the corner of the couch like she'd done it before, legs tucked beneath her, her coat long since discarded, hair falling over her shoulder as she leaned in too close to David. Claire watched the way Vanessa laughed. Head tilted back just enough, mouth parted wide, hand brushing David's arm as if it were the most natural thing in the world. The kind of touch that was too practiced to be accidental. The kind of laugh that carried weight behind it. David didn't recoil. He smiled in that half-lidded, easy way Claire had once loved, nodding along as Vanessa whispered something in his ear. He didn't look at her the way he looked at strangers or colleagues. No, this was softer, familiar, the way someone might look at a person they'd once memorized in pieces. A freckle beneath the jawline, the way she always tucked her thumb under her chin when she laughed. Claire's stomach tightened. Julia caught her eye from across the room, giving her a subtle, raised eyebrow that said more than words could. Claire answered with a practiced smile, quick and brittle, and turned her attention back to the scene playing out on the couch like a private performance no one else was meant to see. Vanessa toyed with the charm at her necklace, a delicate gold key Claire didn't recognize. Her thumb traced the metal in slow, absent-minded circles as she recounted a story from college, the kind Claire had never heard before. Something about an all-night road trip to a music festival, rain, a flat tire, and a motel with one room left. Vanessa's voice grew lower near the end, drawing David in. Claire noted the way his posture shifted, shoulders relaxed, head tilted toward her, a faint smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. A shared secret passed without words. She gripped the stem of the wine glass tighter. Her gaze slid to Vanessa's wrist. A bracelet, thin silver with a blue enamel charm. It shimmered slightly as Vanessa reached for her drink. Claire blinked, her breath catching. It looked familiar. She'd given David something nearly identical years ago. One of those small, impulsive gifts she'd picked out at an art fair, engraved on the inside with a tiny inscription he'd never commented on. But this one had no inscription. Or if it did, it was hidden beneath Vanessa's skin. Claire looked back up, searching David's face. He didn't seem caught. He didn't flinch or check for her reaction. Instead, he leaned back, one arm draped casually over the back of the couch behind Vanessa, fingers not quite touching her shoulder. But close, too close. That invisible line between intimacy and accident had long since blurred. Her pulse fluttered, sharp and erratic. She wasn't angry, not yet. It was something else, something colder, the sharp edge of something she didn't want to name. She remembered the way David had kissed her forehead that morning without looking her in the eye. The text he answered with a too quick, work thing. The way he'd insisted on seating Vanessa next to him at dinner with a shrug and a smile that hadn't reached his eyes. Claire looked away, back to her untouched glass. The room felt louder than before, or maybe just fuller. The laughter, the flicker of the fire, the clink of a spoon in a coffee mug. Everything was moving around her while she remained perfectly still, like she was behind glass, watching, waiting. Somewhere, deep beneath her composure, something stirred. Not rage, not grief, resolve. Dinner was set for 8 sharp. The dining room shimmered under the flickering candlelight, shadows dancing on the walls like whispers waiting to be spoken. Every plate was perfectly aligned, silver polished to a shine, napkins folded into clean, crisp lines. Claire moved around the table with quiet precision, adjusting a fork by half an inch, straightening a glass that hadn't needed it. The red dress she wore clung like armor, elegant, sharp, deliberate. Crimson against her pale skin, lips painted to match. The same shade as the wine in her glass. She hadn't taken a sip. From the hallway came footsteps, slow and deliberately unhurried. Claire didn't turn, but she knew the rhythm. Vanessa appeared in the doorway, dressed in black silk that moved like water when she walked. A slit up the leg, bare shoulders, and that same silver bracelet catching the light with each movement. She smiled as she entered, casual, radiant, as if she belonged here. David followed, his expression unreadable, eyes flicking briefly toward Claire, then away. Claire didn't greet them. She simply gestured to the table, her voice calm, composed. "We're all here." The meal began with forced pleasantries and too many clinking glasses. Conversation slid across the surface like ice. Nothing could stick. Claire kept her expression neutral, nodding, smiling when expected, her hands never trembling. She watched more than she listened. Watched the way David's fingers grazed the base of his wine glass every time Vanessa spoke. Watched the subtle tilt of his body toward her, even when he wasn't looking at her directly. She tracked his glances, the pauses in his breath, the quiet smile that lingered longer than it should have. Vanessa was performing, that much was clear. Laughter just a notch too loud. Questions that circled back to college memories Claire hadn't been a part of. She leaned in, touched David's hand when she spoke to him, fingers resting just a second too long before pulling away. The intimacy between them wasn't in what they said. It was in what they didn't bother hiding. Claire felt none of the heat that used to come with jealousy. That had been burned out long ago. What remained was colder, sharper, focused. Under the table, she reached for her phone. The screen lit briefly, illuminating the gallery she had curated with care. Screenshots, photos, timestamps. Evidence. Proof. Not for him, for her. So when the words left her mouth tomorrow, they would land with the weight of certainty. She glanced down the table. Julia caught her eye briefly, gave her a small, questioning look. Claire answered with the faintest curve of her lips, an almost smile unreadable. She wasn't ready to share what she knew. Not yet. The rest of the evening unfolded in fragments. Someone spilled wine. Ella cracked a joke that no one quite heard. A log in the fireplace popped, startling Vanessa just enough to make Claire's glass tilt in her hand. She didn't flinch. After dessert, when the others filtered into the living room, Claire remained behind to clear the table. Her hands moved methodically, stacking plates, folding napkins, scraping remnants of food into the bin. The clatter of cutlery echoed louder than necessary in the quiet room, a rhythm that steadied her breathing. David stepped in just as she was wiping the last bit of red wine from the tablecloth. He didn't speak at first, just stood in the doorway watching. "You don't have to do that," he said finally. Claire looked up. Her eyes met his, steady and unreadable. "It helps me think." David gave a vague nod, then stepped back without another word. She waited until his footsteps faded before placing the cloth down and turning out the lights, one by one, leaving the room in darkness. Tomorrow there would be no more pretending, no polite deflection, no veiled looks passed across a crowded room. What she'd been building inside herself wasn't rage. It was clarity. The silence she had held like glass was beginning to crack, but not before she was ready. And now she was almost ready. Almost. The front door slammed behind Vanessa, the sound cracking through the cold like a shot. Claire barely registered the gasps behind her as she followed, the warmth of the house vanishing in an instant, replaced by the sting of winter air slicing across her skin. The snow fell harder now, soft but relentless, covering the driveway in a fresh, unmarked layer that muffled her footsteps. Vanessa stood at the far edge of the stone path, her breath rising in quick, hot bursts. Her arms were wrapped tightly around herself, not from cold, but fury. David caught up to her, his pace uneven, his movements jerky, like his limbs no longer answered to reason. "You shouldn't have come," he said through clenched teeth, his voice low and trembling. Not with cold, but with panic. "I told you this would only make things worse." Vanessa turned sharply, her face blotched with heat despite the freezing air. "You begged me to," she hissed. "Don't rewrite this now." David glanced back toward the house, his chest heaving. Lights glowed through the front windows. Shadows moved behind the curtains. He wasn't just afraid of being seen, he was unraveling, thread by thread. "This wasn't the plan," he muttered, running a hand through his hair. "You said you'd stay quiet." "You said." "I said I'd stay quiet if you left her," she cut in. "And you didn't. You're still here, playing perfect husband while I wait in a guest room like some backup dancer in your little Christmas pageant." David stepped closer, too close, and for the first time, Claire saw fear flash in Vanessa's eyes. Not from the cold or the dark or the words, but from the realization that David, always smooth, always in control, had no grip left. "You think this is about her?" he snapped. "This is about me trying to keep everything from falling apart. You showing up like this, throwing everything in her face. What the hell did you expect me to do?" Vanessa's laughter was dry, bitter, too loud for the quiet around them. "I expected you to mean it when you said you loved me." David flinched, not physically, but something in his expression collapsed. His eyes darted, as if looking for a way out, a reset button, anything. But there was only snow and stone and Claire, watching silently from the steps. She could see the rise of his shoulders, the tightness in his fists. He wasn't a violent man, not in the way that leaves bruises. But something was brewing behind his eyes now, an implosion. "I don't know what I meant," he said finally, voice cracking. "Maybe I lied. Maybe I was lying to both of you." Vanessa went still. Her lips parted as if to speak, but the words died. Then she moved toward him, fast, her hand rising not in a slap but a shove, both palms striking his chest. He staggered back a step, caught himself. "You coward," she breathed. "You used me. You let me believe." "Stop," he said, but it came out like a plea. Claire stood motionless, barely breathing. Vanessa stepped forward again, her boots skimming the icy edge of the drive. David reached out, maybe to steady her, maybe just to keep her from advancing again. But it was the wrong motion, too fast, too uncertain. She twisted away from his touch, slipping sideways. One heel skidded, lost traction. Her arms flailed instinctively, eyes wide with sudden terror, body tilting just enough. "Wait, Vanessa!" David lunged. Too late. Her foot hit the stone border and she went down hard. A sickening crack echoed through the air, sharp and final, followed by nothing. No cry, no gasp, just silence. Claire's hand flew to her mouth, her heart hammering. David froze, eyes locked on the still figure at his feet. His breath came in ragged gasps, his hands hovering uselessly in the air. "I didn't push her," he whispered. "I didn't." He took a step back. Snow had already begun to settle on Vanessa's dark hair, melting slowly into the wool of her coat. Her face was turned to the side, obscured. Claire couldn't see if her eyes were open. She took one step off the porch, the cold barely registering now. Her vision tunneled on David, who stood staring like a man who just walked through a door and couldn't remember why. He looked up at her then, slowly, like turning his head took effort, and his face was no longer angry or ashamed. It was empty. "Claire," he said, barely audible. She didn't answer. In the distance, wind moved through the trees with a sound like rushing water, and the snow kept falling, covering everything. Tracks, blood, breath in silence. In the dim glow of the study, Claire sat motionless, her fingers resting lightly on the edge of the keyboard, the screen's pale light flickering across her face. Outside, the storm had slowed, but the wind still whispered against the windows like something unfinished, something still circling the house. David's laptop was warm beneath her palms. She hadn't expected it to be opened so easily, hadn't expected it to feel like a confession in her hands. The cursor blinked, steady, patient. The silence of the room thickened around her. She moved quickly at first, clearing emails, deleting cloud syncs, dragging folder after folder to the trash. Her actions were sharp, methodical. But with each click, a dull ache bloomed in her chest. It wasn't guilt. Not yet. It was weight. The weight of knowing that every file she erased was a piece of the man she thought she'd known, and a piece of the life she'd helped him protect. She wasn't doing this for David. Not anymore. She was doing it for Ella and Max, for the fragile innocence that still lingered in their questions, for the version of Christmas that could be salvaged in memories, for herself, perhaps most of all, for the woman she used to be, the one who had spent years stitching cracks in silence, who had smiled through parties, through dinners, through dimly lit suspicions she dared not name. She found the folder almost by accident. It had no name, buried beneath layers of old financial spreadsheets and client contracts. The files inside weren't labeled either, just numbers and dates. But Claire knew. The images loaded slowly, and with each one, her throat tightened. Not just Vanessa, a woman on a balcony, leaning into David's chest. Another in a dimly lit lounge, her hand resting lightly on his thigh. Blurred glimpses of smiles that weren't meant for her. Eyes lit in ways she hadn't seen in years. Her fingers hovered over the touchpad, unmoving. She didn't cry. Her body had forgotten how. She closed the folder gently, not with rage but with a kind of reverence. Not for the man in the photos but for the truth they gave her. When the floor creaked behind her, she didn't flinch. Ella stood in the doorway, her hair messy, her eyes heavy with something more than just exhaustion. "Mom?" she asked, barely above a whisper. "Is Dad going to jail?" Claire turned slowly. The light from the screen made her daughter look younger somehow, like the child she used to rock to sleep after nightmares. She crossed the room and wrapped her arms around her, resting her cheek against Ella's hair. "I don't know," she said, and it was the most honest answer she had left. She felt her daughter nod against her shoulder, small and quiet. Claire held her a moment longer than necessary before guiding her back to the couch, tucking a blanket over her, fingers brushing hair from her forehead the way she used to. She waited until Ella's breathing slowed before returning to the dining room. David hadn't moved. His elbows were on the table, his head bowed low, hands threaded through his hair. The bourbon glass sat untouched beside him, a crescent of condensation on the wood. Claire stood across from him, her reflection faint in the window behind him. Two ghosts on opposite sides of glass. She slid the folder across the table. Her nails, still stained faintly from cranberry sauce, caught the edge as she pulled her hand away. David looked up, his eyes bloodshot, rimmed with something too soft to be regret and too empty to be grief. "What is this?" he asked, his voice wrecked. She didn't answer right away. Her fingers curled into her palm, the skin over her knuckles pulled tight. "It's the story you'll tell," she said finally. "To the police, to the press, to our kids." He stared at her, and for a moment, she wondered if he'd argue, if he'd try to rewrite it again. But his shoulders sagged, and he said nothing. "I thought you hated me," he murmured. Claire's lips twitched, not into a smile. "I don't have room for hate right now." She turned and walked away before he could speak again. As she passed the foyer, she paused by the front window. The snow had begun to fall again. Soft, delicate, relentless. It blanketed the driveway, smoothing over footprints, blood, the imprint of where Vanessa's body had been. Everything would be clean by morning. But Claire knew better than anyone. Some stains don't show in snow. Some stay, buried under silence, waiting. And she would carry that silence, every breath of it, until it served her. Claire lingered at the top of the stairs, one hand resting on the banister as though she needed it to remain upright. The phone still buzzed faintly in her palm, a soft tremor that felt alive, almost sentient. Her thumb hovered over the green answer icon, hesitating longer than she should have. The hallway behind her stretched quiet and dark, its familiar corners now tinged with the same uncertainty that had seeped into every part of her home. She hadn't cried. Not since the fall. Not when the sheriff arrived. Not even when Ella had curled into her arms and asked if their family would ever feel normal again. But now, as her heart pounded against her ribs and the screen blinked with unknown caller, something deep in her chest stirred. A cold ripple of dread layered beneath something else she hadn't wanted to name. Anticipation. She pressed the phone to her ear. There was a pause, a breath, then static, faint but deliberate, like someone letting her know they were there, listening first. Then, a man's voice, rough-edged, low, not threatening, but not harmless either. "She wasn't the only one," he said. Claire's pulse jumped, her lips parting without sound. "She didn't speak. And she told me everything." Click. The call ended. The silence that followed felt unnatural, charged. Claire lowered the phone slowly, her grip tightening as the screen faded to black. For a moment she just stood there, blinking into the stillness, trying to quiet the pounding in her ears. Her throat was dry, her fingers tingled. She turned and walked down the hall toward the bedroom, not quite knowing why. Inside, the bed remained untouched, the duvet smooth, the pillows undisturbed, as if it had been prepared for someone who never made it back. Claire sat at the edge and stared at the phone in her lap. The voice echoed again in her mind. She told me everything. But what did everything mean? What had Vanessa told him? What hadn't she told Claire? The weight of the folder she'd given David only hours ago returned to her memory. All the truths she thought she had controlled, shaped, sealed. But now she could feel it unraveling slowly with purpose. She looked up toward the window, where morning light was just beginning to bleed through the frost-patterned glass. It cast long, uneven shadows across the floorboards, slicing through the room in fractured light. She remembered how Vanessa had stood in this same room 2 nights ago, arms crossed, eyes searching, like someone who already knew her time was running out. Claire rose and crossed to the dresser, pulling open the top drawer. At the very back, beneath layers of scarves, she found the flash drive she'd taken from David's briefcase weeks ago, before any of this had started. She hadn't opened it, hadn't needed to, until now. She turned it over in her hand, her reflection flickering in the metal. She hadn't wanted to become this woman, calculating, careful, always a step ahead. But she wasn't sure anymore where the line had been, or when she'd stepped over it. There was no going back. A knock sounded downstairs, 2 short, 1 long, measured. Claire's breath caught. She slipped the flash drive into her pocket and moved toward the hallway with slow, cautious steps. By the time she reached the bottom of the staircase, the knock had stopped. Through the stained glass slats of the front door, she could just make out the silhouette of someone turning away. Male, tall, shoulders hunched against the wind. There was no package on the step, no card. Claire didn't open the door. She stood in the foyer for a long time after he disappeared, the weight of the house pressing down around her like a lid on a boiling pot. Her mind was already working, spinning through Vanessa's final days, the conversations she had half heard, the names she didn't recognize. Someone else knew, someone who wasn't finished. And for the first time since the fall, Claire realized the tragedy on the driveway hadn't been the end. It had only been the spark. Claire stood at the window long after the police car disappeared down the road, its tire tracks carving 2 stark lines through the fresh snow. Her breath left faint clouds on the glass, fading before they could linger, just like him. David was gone now, truly gone, and yet his presence still clung to the corners of the house like an old, sour scent that wouldn't lift. She hadn't moved in over 10 minutes. Her arms were folded tight across her chest, not from cold but from something deeper, something twisted in on itself. Her fingers pressed into the soft wool of her sweater, nails indenting skin. a subconscious effort to keep herself contained. If she let go now, if she unfolded even a little, she wasn't sure what might spill out. Behind her, the house was silent. The kind of silence that felt like aftermath. The kind that rang in the ears, louder than any storm. She turned slowly and looked at the space that had once been their living room. The tree still stood in the corner, lights twinkling weakly, ornaments dull in the pale daylight. A single wrapped gift lay untouched beneath it. David's, she realized. She hadn't opened it. She wouldn't. The mug of tea she'd poured that morning sat untouched on the side table. The liquid inside had gone cold, the surface undisturbed. Claire picked it up absently, held it for a beat, then walked it into the kitchen and poured it down the sink. The empty cup clattered as she set it on the counter, louder than expected. Her hands trembled once, then steadied. She'd been numb for days, but now, something was shifting. Not a thaw, not yet, but the beginning of one. Her body ached, not from fatigue but from holding too much. Too many thoughts, too many memories, too many questions she'd been forced to stop asking because the answers would undo her. But now she knew what undoing felt like, and it hadn't killed her. She opened a drawer and pulled out a pad of paper. The pages were stiff, the edges crisp. It had been years since she'd used it for anything but grocery lists and polite notes to teachers. She sat at the kitchen table and began to write. Not a confession, not a letter to David. Plan. Her handwriting came slow at first, shaky, then steadier with each line. She mapped out what needed to happen next. A call to the real estate agent. A meeting with the lawyer, her lawyer this time. Paperwork to be reviewed. Accounts to be transferred. Assets divided. The studio she'd been too afraid to rent, back in town, closer to the lake. The one with the wide windows and cracked brick walls. She would call about that tomorrow. And then the names of the women, the ones she'd found in the files. First names only. Enough to remember. Enough to not forget. She would find a way to reach them. Not all at once, not for revenge, not for spectacle. Just to say, I know. I believe you. I'm sorry. Words she wished someone had said to her much sooner. Claire set the pen down and looked at the page. It wasn't long. It wasn't neat. But it was hers. A knock sounded from upstairs. Soft. Hesitant. Ella's voice followed. Mom! Claire stood and walked to the foot of the stairs. I'm here. Ella appeared at the top, arms wrapped around herself. Her eyes were rimmed with the redness of someone who hadn't slept much in days. She looked like a question Claire didn't know how to answer. Is it over? Ella asked. Claire took a slow breath. No, she said. But it's beginning to be. Ella nodded, eyes glassy. Can we leave this house? Not now, but soon. Claire climbed a few steps until they were nearly level. She reached out, brushing her daughter's hair back, tucking it behind her ear like she used to when Ella was small. Yes, she said. We will. They stayed like that for a while, until Ella slipped back toward her room and Claire descended the stairs again. Lighter somehow. She paused in the foyer and looked at the row of family photos on the wall. Her fingers hovered over the frame of one from a decade ago. David holding Max on his shoulders, Ella mid-laugh, Claire beside them, hand resting on her husband's chest. She took it down gently, opened the back, and removed the photo. Just the photo. The frame stayed on the wall, empty but ready. Later that evening, she lit a fire in the hearth for the first time in days. Not because she needed the warmth, but because the crackle of it reminded her of movement, of life returning slowly to stillness. She sat cross-legged on the rug, a blanket over her shoulders, and let herself finally feel tired. She didn't know what the man on the phone might do, whether the truth would grow quieter or louder now. But she had stopped fearing what it might cost to let it rise. For years, her life had been framed around control. Curated smiles, perfect holidays, polished glass. But the truth had come through anyway, like water through cracks. Now she would let it stay, build something from it. Maybe not peace, but something honest, something whole. And in the flickering firelight, with snow still falling outside and silence no longer threatening, Claire closed her eyes. not in escape, but in rest. For the first time in years, she allowed herself that.